You wake up early, not because you have to, but because your body never learned how to sleep in. The house is quiet, always is, at this hour. You sit for a moment before moving, listening, not for sounds, but for the absence of them. Silence still feels like safety to you. It always has. You grew up letting yourself in. Latchkey kid, key on a string, or hidden under a rock you were told never to tell anyone about. Nobody checked in. Nobody hovered. You figured things out because there was no alternative. And somehow, that became your default setting. People like to talk about generations as if they're personalities. Loud ones, optimistic ones, anxious ones, entitled ones, sensitive ones. You've noticed something. They don't talk about you much. You exist in the background of the conversation, the way you've existed most of your life. Present, necessary, rarely acknowledged. The generation between the boom and the echo. Between analog and digital. Between authority and disruption. You learned early that stability was temporary. You watched companies promise loyalty, then cut people loose with cardboard boxes. You saw marriages collapse after decades of doing everything right. You were told to work hard, keep your head down, and trust the system. Then watch the system rewrite the rules without warning. So you adapted, not dramatically, quietly. You stopped expecting permanence. You stopped believing in guarantees. You learned how to be competent without needing applause, useful without being visible. That's the part people miss about you. You don't resist change because you hate it. You resist hype because you've seen how fast it evaporates. You remember life before everything was documented, before mistakes followed you forever, before privacy became a luxury product. When something went wrong back then, it stayed local. It faded. It became a story you told or didn't tell. You weren't haunted by versions of yourself preserved online, so you're careful now. Not because you don't understand technology, but because you understand consequences. You watched the internet arrive like a promise, freedom, access, possibility, and then you watched it harden into surveillance, performance, noise. You learned to use it without becoming it. That's why you don't overshare. That's why you don't announce every thought. That's why you don't confuse visibility with value. You've always trusted skill more than slogans. At work, you're the one people rely on when things break, not the loudest voice in the room. The one who knows where the backup is. The one who can still function when systems go down. You've worked with tools that no longer exist. You remember fixing things instead of replacing them. You remember when knowledge required effort. Libraries, manuals, trial and error. You didn't grow up Googling answers. You grew up hunting them. That shaped how you think. When faced with a problem, you don't panic. You deconstruct. You look for leverage. You assume you'll have to handle more than you were told. Because you always did. You're calm in crises because chaos feels familiar. You're uneasy in comfort because comfort has betrayed you before. People mistake that for pessimism. It's not. It's realism earned the hard way. You don't expect things to work out. You make contingency plans. You assume something will go wrong, and quietly prepare to handle it when it does. That's why you don't talk much about the future. You've lived through enough once-in-a-lifetime events to stop believing in tidy narratives. Cold War drills. Economic crashes, dot-com bubbles, financial collapses, pandemics. You learned that history doesn't move smoothly. It lurches, and you learned how to stay upright when it does. You notice something now that you're older. The world is becoming more unstable, not less. Careers fragment. Institutions wobble. Certainty erodes. Younger generations feel overwhelmed by this. You don't. You were trained in uncertainty. You grew up when authority figures contradicted themselves. When leaders lied on television, when trust fractured slowly, then all at once, you learned not to anchor your identity to institutions that could disappear overnight. That's why you built competence instead. You don't define yourself by a job title. You define yourself by what you can handle, what you can fix, what you can survive. And now, quietly, the future is starting to look more like you than anyone expected. The traits that once made you feel out of step are becoming advantages. Self-reliance, adaptability, skepticism without nihilism, competence without ego. You don't need a system to tell you who you are. You learned that systems change. You watch younger generations wrestle with identity online, trying to define themselves early, loudly, permanently. You don't judge them, but you know something they haven't learned yet. You know that identity evolves whether you want it to or not. You also know the cost of pretending it doesn't. You've always existed in the in-between. Between analog childhoods and digital adulthoods, between authority and rebellion, between optimism and resignation. That liminal space shaped you. You don't cling to youth. You don't romanticize the past. You don't rush toward the future. You stand in the middle and observe. That's not indecision, that's perspective. You've raised children differently than you were raised. You gave them attention you didn't have, safety you didn't feel. But sometimes you worry. You wonder if too much protection made them fragile, if constant supervision taught them to doubt themselves, if growing up visible robbed them of the ability to be alone with their thoughts. You don't say this out loud much. It sounds judgmental when it isn't. It's concern. The same concern you've always had, for consequences people haven't noticed yet. You know, boredom builds resilience. You know, solitude builds problem solving. You know, being unseen sometimes builds strength because it built you. The irony is that you were shaped by absence of supervision, of certainty, of reassurance, and that absence taught you how to stand on your own. You don't romanticize it. You know it hurt. You know it hardened you in places. You know it made vulnerability difficult. You're loyal, but slow to trust, capable, but reluctant to ask for help, generous, but guarded. You learned that depending too much on others could cost you. So you became dependable instead. That habit never left. Now, as the future feels less predictable for everyone, people start looking to you. Not for inspiration, but for stability. You don't broadcast leadership, you model it. You don't promise things will be okay. You quietly make sure they are. When systems wobble, you're already adjusting. When plans fall apart, you're already improvising. When chaos hits, you don't freeze, you focus. That's your superpower, not hope, not certainty, competence under pressure. You were never the loudest generation. You were the load-bearing one. And here's the part you're only starting to realize. You weren't overlooked because you lacked impact. You were overlooked because you didn't need attention to function. The future isn't going to be flashy. It's going to be fragmented, adaptive, uneven, demanding. And that's familiar territory for you. You don't need everything to make sense. You just need enough clarity to take the next step. You've always lived that way. You've never needed the spotlight. You've never needed permission. You've never needed applause. You just needed room to operate. So when people talk about who's prepared for what's coming, about resilience, adaptability, realism, you recognize the qualities immediately. You've been carrying them quietly for decades. You didn't inherit optimism. You earned endurance. And now, as the world grows more complex, that might matter more than anyone realizes. You're Generation X. You were built in the gaps, trained in uncertainty, shaped by contradiction, and the future is finally starting to look like the world you've been navigating all along. If this felt uncomfortably accurate, subscribe. This channel is for people who learned early how to stand on their own and are quietly ready for what comes next.